Midway has been told so often that it can start to sound inevitable. The Japanese came, the Americans waited, the code breakers had solved the riddle, the dive bombers arrived at the perfect moment, for great carriers burned, and the Pacific War changed direction in a single afternoon. That version is not false, but it is too smooth. It hides how much depended on uncertainty, exhaustion, error, improvisation, and men making irreversible decisions inside a few brutal hours. Midway was not a miracle that dropped neatly out of the sky. It was a collision between ambition and intelligence, between doctrine and chance, between a navy trying to extend an empire at the very edge of confidence and another navy trying to survive long enough to seize the first real opening since Pearl Harbor. It mattered because it took place at exactly the moment when Japan still seemed almost unstoppable and the United States still had just enough strength left to gamble. By June 1942, only 6 months had passed since Pearl Harbor, but those months had rearranged the Pacific with frightening speed. The Philippines were collapsing. Guam had fallen. Wake had fallen. Singapore had fallen to Japan, and British prestige in Asia had been broken in a way that shocked the world. The Dutch East Indies were in Japanese hands. American and Allied naval power had been blooded, dispersed, and forced into improvisation. In military terms, Japan looked like a state operating at the height of momentum. Its carrier arm had struck from Hawaii to the Indian Ocean. Its naval aircrews were experienced, hard-trained, and confident. The Imperial Japanese Navy had earned its reputation honestly. It had not bluffed its way to dominance. It had won it. And yet victory had already begun changing into danger. Success creates its own pressure. Empires expanding quickly must decide what to do with momentum before momentum starts to decay. The Japanese High Command knew that the United States still retained the industrial base and strategic depth to become overwhelmingly dangerous if given time. The carriers that had escaped destruction at Pearl Harbor were still alive. The Coral Sea battle in May 1942 had already shown that the Americans could hit back and that Japanese expansion could be checked, even if only imperfectly. Midway emerged out of this strategic urgency. Japan wanted one more decisive blow. It wanted to lure out the surviving American carriers, destroy them, seize Midway, expand the defensive perimeter, and secure the Central Pacific in a way that might force the United States into a longer, more uncertain war of approach. To understand Midway, you have to understand how the Imperial Japanese Navy thought about decisive battle. Its strategic culture had long been shaped by the idea that a great fleet action could settle the fate of an oceanic struggle. Even as naval aviation transformed warfare, older habits of thought remained intertwined with newer methods. Carrier striking power had become central, but it still served a broader logic: weaken the enemy, lure him into disadvantage, and destroy his remaining fleet in a climactic encounter. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto understood American industrial potential as well as any Japanese leader did. He also understood that time favored the United States. That is why he kept reaching for bold, offensive solutions. Midway was not conceived as a marginal operation. It was conceived as the operation that would restore strategic clarity before time began working more visibly against Japan. The Midway plan was, in one sense, ingenious. In another, it was dangerously complicated. Yamamoto intended to strike Midway Atoll, a tiny but important American outpost northwest of Hawaii, forcing the U.S. Pacific Fleet to respond. Japanese forces would appear in multiple directions. A northern diversion would hit the Aleutians. The main carrier striking force under Nagumo would attack Midway and then, if the American carriers appeared, destroy them. Behind this came heavier units, including battleships, whose presence reflected both Japanese strength and Japanese doctrinal habit. On paper, the plan offered surprise and concentration. In practice, it dispersed Japanese forces over a vast area, making mutual support harder at the precise moment when speed of reaction would matter most. It was an operation designed by a navy at the peak of its confidence and already beginning to overburden itself with its own complexity. On the American side, everything rested on a different kind of edge, not momentum, but recovery. Admiral Chester Nimitz did not possess the luxury of fighting Midway under ideal conditions. He had too few carriers, too little margin, and no guarantee that the intelligence picture he was building would hold once the shooting began. But he did have one immense advantage, and it was the advantage that made the battle possible in the form we remember it. American cryptanalysts had broken enough of the Japanese naval code to identify Midway, AF, as the likely target. This was not omniscience. Code breaking never gives a commander divine certainty. It gives him fragments, patterns, probability, and the chance to place scarce force where it might matter. The famous ruse in which Midway sent a false uncoded message about water shortages, followed by Japanese encrypted traffic reporting that AF was short on water, confirmed what the analysts believed. Midway was the target. Intelligence is only useful if leaders trust it enough to act. Nimitz did. He prepared an ambush with the means he had: Enterprise and Hornet under Raymond Spruance, Yorktown under Frank Jack Fletcher, and the air assets on Midway itself. Yorktown's presence alone carried a story of American improvisation that belongs at the center of the battle. Damaged at Coral Sea and expected to require months of repairs, the carrier was patched at Pearl Harbor in a furious burst of labor and sent back out in a condition that was good enough because it had to be. Midway was that kind of battle. There was no ideal readiness. There was only enough readiness to try. Midway Atoll itself was small, isolated, and strategically disproportionate to its size. It was valuable because of where it sat, forward enough to matter, defensible enough to serve as a warning post and strike base, and symbolically important because Japan's seizure of it would extend the threat toward Hawaii and deepen the psychological consequences of Pearl Harbor. For the men stationed there, Midway was not an abstract point on an operations map. It was coral, heat, logistics, aircraft, guns, and the knowledge that if the Japanese came in force, they would be expected to absorb the first strike and continue fighting anyway. The island's defenders have sometimes been overshadowed by the more famous carrier actions of June 4th, but that obscures how essential they were to the battle's opening rhythm. Midway's patrol aircraft found Japanese elements. Midway's bombers and torpedo planes attacked repeatedly. Many of these attacks achieved little direct damage. Some were slaughtered. But in a carrier battle where time and command attention mattered almost as much as bombs, the very persistence of Midway-based attacks helped drag Nagumo through a morning of decision under pressure. The island was not just a target. It was a participant, and the battle's tempo cannot be understood without it. The Japanese carrier striking force, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, was still among the most formidable naval air groupings ever assembled. These were not empty decks with anonymous aircraft. They represented the cutting edge of Japanese naval warfare and the concentrated experience of the service's best-trained aviators. Pearl Harbor, the Indian Ocean raid, and earlier Pacific operations had all confirmed their lethality. Carrier warfare in 1942 was still young enough that experience mattered enormously. Japan possessed it in abundance. The American carriers, by contrast, were improving but still less seasoned in the aggregate. Midway was therefore not simply a test of material. It was a confrontation between two systems of naval aviation, one of which had spent the early war winning and one of which was still learning how to survive. Yet the Japanese carrier force also carried hidden strain. Combat experience is invaluable, but it consumes irreplaceable skill. Operations at high tempo wear down ships, flight decks, aircraft, and men. The concentration of talent that made the force so dangerous also made it vulnerable. Lose enough trained carrier aviators and the damage would not be easily repaired, even if hulls could in theory be replaced. This is one of the great strategic themes of Midway. The battle did not just sink ships. It accelerated the erosion of a human advantage Japan could not readily regenerate. The opening movements on the 3rd of June already demonstrated one of Midway's enduring truths: naval battle at this scale was also a battle of incomplete information. American patrol aircraft located parts of the approaching Japanese force and attacked transport elements, though the first reports were imperfect and early strikes did not inflict decisive harm. Even so, the fact that Midway-based aviation found the enemy before the decisive carrier clash mattered psychologically. It meant the Japanese were entering a battle space where the Americans were not blind. On the Japanese side, reconnaissance would become one of the battle's most fateful weaknesses. Nagumo's scout plan was not absurd, but it was thinner and more fragile than events required. Search aircraft launched with gaps, delays, and limited coverage over a broad ocean. This was one of those seemingly technical details that later acquire world historical significance. Great battles often turn on reconnaissance not because scouting sounds dramatic, but because every other decision depends on what is believed to be present or absent over the horizon. Midway would become one of the clearest demonstrations in naval history that delayed information can be as lethal as enemy fire. Before dawn on the 4th of June, the Japanese launched their initial strike against Midway. The attack wave was formidable and disciplined, and when it reached the atoll it inflicted serious damage. Installations were hit, fires started, and the island was battered, though not knocked out as a functioning base. The Japanese strike leader reported that a second attack would be required to finish the job. This was the first great pivot of the battle. Nagumo had launched part of his power against the island while keeping a reserve strike available. Now he had to decide what to do next while incomplete search reports continued to trickle in. To understand the pressure on Nagumo, one must resist the hindsight temptation to treat his choices as obviously foolish. Carrier warfare in 1942 presented commanders with terrible decision chains. Aircraft on deck or in hangars had to be armed, fueled, rearmed, moved, and launched in sequences that consumed time and created vulnerability. If no American carriers were near, the reserve should logically be prepared to strike Midway again. If American carriers were near, anti-ship ordnance would be required. The trouble was that the intelligence picture changed while the machinery of aviation was already in motion. Nagumo's reserve aircraft were shifted toward land attack configuration and then, as reports of enemy ships grew more alarming, shifted back toward anti-ship attack. This rearming cycle became one of the battle's most famous elements not because it was uniquely chaotic by carrier standards, but because the timing proved catastrophic. While Nagumo wrestled with his decks, American attacks began arriving in waves, and failing in ways that would later almost be forgotten beneath the triumph that followed. Midway-based aircraft came in first. Marine fighters were mauled. Army and Marine bombers attacked. Torpedo planes pressed in. The results in terms of hits were meager or non-existent. The cost was severe. But these attacks mattered because they imposed friction, consumed Japanese attention, complicated deck operations, and kept the carrier force under recurring pressure. In retrospect they look like preludes. In real time they were the battle. Then came the torpedo squadrons from the American carriers, and here the story turns almost unbearably grim. Torpedo Squadron 8 from Hornet, Torpedo Squadron 6 from Enterprise, and Torpedo Squadron 3 from Yorktown attacked at low altitude, unsupported or inadequately coordinated with fighter cover and dive bombers. They were massacred. Slow aircraft pressing toward heavily defended carriers faced swarms of Japanese fighters and intense anti-aircraft fire. Their torpedoes performed poorly. Their formations broke apart. Many crews died without landing a single decisive blow. Yet their sacrifice did something operationally immense. It pulled Japanese combat air patrol down to sea level, scattered defensive focus, and created the exact opening that the incoming American dive bombers would exploit. This is one of Midway's hardest truths: catastrophe for one set of attackers created possibility for another. The battle's turning point was built partly out of visible failure. The famous arrival of the American dive bombers around 10:20 in the morning has been retold so often that it risks becoming too tidy. In reality, the path there was confused, contentious, and deeply human. Squadrons from Enterprise and Yorktown were searching vast ocean space with incomplete contact information. Some commanders made decisions that remain debated. Wade McCluskey's choice to continue searching and then to follow the wake of the destroyer Arashi back toward the Japanese carriers has become legendary because it captured the battle's dependence on inference and nerve. Had he turned back earlier, had fuel concerns overridden instinct, had the destroyer not been where it was, the timing might have been radically different. What the dive bombers found when they finally reached the Japanese carriers was a target state carrier commander's dread, decks and hangars in transition, fuel and ordnance involved in rearming, fighter cover displaced downward, attention saturated by earlier attacks, and ships maneuvering under stress. In a matter of minutes, 3 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Sarayu, were hit fatally. Bombs struck where they could ignite aviation fuel, munitions, aircraft, and the dense operational infrastructure of carrier war. The violence was not immediate sinking so much as internal doom. Fires raged beyond control. Damage control struggles became hopeless. The Japanese force that had opened the morning with crushing striking power found itself mortally wounded in a span of time so short that later memory almost cannot believe it. Yet the battle was not over, and that matters. Hiryu survived the first disaster and still possessed aircraft capable of inflicting heavy damage. Japanese carrier aviation, even now, remained dangerous enough to punish American overconfidence. Hiryu launched attacks that found Yorktown, the carrier already wounded at Coral Sea, and hurried back into service by sheer American labor. The first strike damaged her badly but not fatally. For a short time she seemed to recover, an extraordinary testament to American damage control. Then a second Japanese strike struck again, and Yorktown was left crippled. Here the battle's emotional texture changed once more. American triumph and vulnerability existed simultaneously. Even amid Japan's enormous losses, the United States was being reminded what carrier war still cost. Hiryu's survival also gave the Japanese a temporary center around which purpose could still gather. Had she escaped longer, had her strikes multiplied, had American searches faltered, Midway might still have produced a very different afternoon. But American scouting and strike capability held long enough. Later on the 4th of June, dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown located and hit Hiryu. With that, all four first-line Japanese carriers committed to the operation were doomed. The symbolic force of this cannot be overstated. In one battle, in a single day's main action, the offensive spearhead that had helped carry Japan across the Pacific was broken. Yorktown's afterlife in the battle deserves its own place because it reveals how narrow the American margin still was. The carrier did not vanish when first hit. Efforts to save her were real, disciplined, and brave. Damage control is one of the least glamorous but most decisive arts in naval war, and at Midway it helped keep an American flat top in the fight longer than the Japanese expected. Later, as salvage continued, Japanese submarine attack finished what air attack had begun. Yorktown eventually sank, and with her the destroyer Hammann as well. This mattered strategically because the US Navy could not yet absorb carrier losses casually. Every deck counted. The final balance of the battle is why Midway became so famous. Japan lost the carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, along with many aircraft and a critical mass of trained aviators and maintenance personnel. The United States lost Yorktown and suffered severe aircraft and crew losses. This was not painless victory. But it was decisive because the asymmetry of losses fell on the part of Japan's naval power it could least afford to lose quickly. Hulls were one thing. Elite carrier air groups and the institutional edge they represented were another. Midway was also a battle about the evolution of naval warfare itself. Before the Second World War, battleships still occupied the center of many naval imaginations as the ultimate arbiters of sea power. Carrier advocates had gained influence, but not all implications had yet been absorbed. Midway made those implications impossible to ignore. The decisive blows were delivered by aircraft against ships that often never saw the enemy directly. Great fleets maneuvered in relation to one another while their lethal reach extended far beyond the visual horizon. Commanders were making decisions based on scouting reports, radio traffic, estimated positions, and strike timing in a world where the battle line had become invisible. This did not mean battleships became irrelevant overnight or that naval strategy suddenly simplified around carriers. But it did mean that the hierarchy of naval power had changed in plain view. Midway, like Coral Sea before it, demonstrated that carrier aviation could decide a campaign-scale battle before opposing surface fleets ever met in the old style. The psychological consequence of this was enormous. Every major navy had to reckon more fully with the fact that air groups, deck cycle management, scouting, and fighter control were now central to maritime victory. Midway was not the first sign of this revolution. It was one of the most convincing proofs. Why did Japan lose at Midway? The question invites easy answers: American code breaking, Japanese overconfidence, the late scout plane, Nagumo's rearming dilemma, sheer luck. All are part of the story, but none alone is sufficient. Code breaking mattered because it allowed Nimitz to place his few carriers in ambush rather than grope across the Pacific in ignorance. Japanese reconnaissance weaknesses mattered because delayed information distorted decision-making at the worst possible moment. Nagumo's dilemma mattered because carrier operations under uncertainty punish hesitation more mercilessly than simpler forms of war. American luck mattered because timing in battle often contains elements no doctrine controls. But behind these factors lay something deeper. Japan had designed a highly ambitious operation whose complexity magnified the cost of friction, while the Americans entered a more concentrated fight with clearer foreknowledge and fewer illusions about their margin. There is also the issue of strategic overreach. Japan at Midway still looked powerful, but it was already entering the dangerous zone where offensive success encourages plans that are too elaborate for the available command and reconnaissance structure. Yamamoto's force dispersal, the Aleutian diversion, the layering of striking forces and supporting forces, all reflected ambition. Ambition is not in itself a flaw. But at Midway it helped create a battle in which the most important Japanese assets were committed forward without the kind of support or informational clarity that might have made disaster easier to contain. The Americans, by contrast, fought with less abundance and therefore with a kind of brutal strategic economy. They had no luxury but concentration. On the American side, Midway quickly became one of the founding victories of the modern war narrative. After months of defeat, retreat, and improvisation, it offered something the United States desperately needed: proof that Japan could not only be resisted but decisively hurt. Morale effects in war are often dismissed as soft, but they are not soft to the societies living through them. Midway altered expectation. It did not end Japanese power in the Pacific. It did not instantly place the United States on offensive supremacy. But it created the first clear sense that the war's direction was not fixed in Japan's favor. In that sense, it was a turning point not because everything reversed immediately, but because confidence and initiative began moving onto different rails. For Japan, the psychological consequences were subtler but profound. The empire did not collapse in June 1942. It still held vast territories. It could still fight fiercely and effectively. But Midway imposed losses that could not be explained away as temporary misfortune. The carrier striking force that had carried Japan through the opening triumphs of the war had been cut down. The image of invincibility had been punctured. And because the Japanese command culture and wartime information system did not publicize disaster transparently, the battle's internal strategic lessons had to compete with institutional habits of concealment and prestige. Midway did not only remove ships. It tested whether Japan's naval system could absorb shock creatively. In the longer war, that test mattered as much as the tactical result. One of the reasons Midway still grips historians is the role of chance without surrendering to chance as explanation. The battle contains moments so contingent that they seem almost scripted: a delayed scout plane, a destroyer's wake, dive bombers arriving just as Japanese decks were most vulnerable, torpedo squadrons dying at the exact moment their sacrifice was creating the conditions for success elsewhere. It is tempting to say that Midway was won by luck. That is too simple. Luck does not place carriers where codebreakers say the enemy will strike. Luck does not repair Yorktown fast enough to send her back into battle. Luck does not train pilots, organize searches, or maintain nerve across command chains. But luck does influence which well-prepared force is rewarded first when the battlefield becomes a machine for magnifying small timing differences. The right lesson is harder and more unsettling. Midway was a battle in which preparedness created the possibility of luck mattering in one's favor. The Americans did many things right enough that good fortune could become decisive rather than merely decorative. The Japanese made enough errors under enough pressure that bad fortune could become fatal. Great battles often look like chance from the outside because human beings remember the moments where everything hinged. But those moments hinge only because systems, decisions, and preparations have already narrowed the range of outcomes. Midway is therefore not the story of luck defeating strength. It is the story of uncertainty entering a contest that both sides had prepared for very differently. Midway also changed the way the Pacific War would have to be fought afterward. Japan could still attempt offensives, but the strategic environment had shifted. The initiative could no longer be assumed. The US Navy, battered but surviving, would now fight with a clearer sense that Japanese carrier power was finite. Soon Guadalcanal would open another brutal chapter in which exhaustion, logistics, and attrition would take center stage. Midway did not win Guadalcanal, and Guadalcanal did not merely follow automatically from Midway. Yet the two are linked by strategic momentum. Without Midway, the Americans likely lack the confidence and naval flexibility to take the offensive in the Solomons when they did. Without Guadalcanal, Midway remains a great victory without immediate exploitation. History rarely turns on one battle alone. It turns when one battle alters what the next battle can mean. In that sense, Midway was not only a tactical masterpiece or intelligence triumph. It was a hinge. Before Midway, Japan still looked like the power setting the terms of Pacific War. After Midway, it remained dangerous, but the terms had changed. The Americans had demonstrated that they could wait, strike, lose dearly, and still emerge holding the larger result. The Pacific would remain a theater of monstrous fighting for years. But the future after Midway no longer belonged to Japan in the same easy, forward-moving way it had in the first half of 1942. And still, the battle's emotional core may lie not in strategy but in the men who flew into it knowing very little beyond the next instruction. Torpedo crews went in low and almost defenseless against concentrated fire. Dive bomber crews searched open ocean with fuel gauges pressing judgment into every minute. Damage control parties on stricken ships entered compartments where fire, smoke, and explosions made survival improbable. Signalmen, mechanics, ordnance handlers, and radar operators all inhabited worlds in which a few minutes could separate routine from annihilation. When we speak of fur carriers burning, we risk making the battle sound mechanical. In reality, it was intensely bodily, men trapped in steel and aviation fuel, men scanning sky and sea, men making decisions so quickly that later generations would spend decades explaining what they themselves had no time to narrate. That is why Midway remains so alive. It compresses into a single battle the vulnerability of power at its height, the value of intelligence when trusted but never worshipped, the cruelty of sacrifice that seems fruitless until history reveals what it purchased, and the way whole wars can pivot not through certainty but through a violent convergence of preparation, error, courage, and timing. For carriers. A few hours. A morning in June. That was enough to change the Pacific. There is another reason the battle never stops attracting argument. It sits at the border between heroic narrative and systems history. The heroic narrative is obvious. Pilots flew into lethal airspace. Commanders guessed correctly at critical moments. Damaged ships fought to survive. Men who were certain they might die continued pressing attacks that seemed hopeless. All of that is true. But Midway is also one of the great systems battles of modern war. It was won in part by code-breaking offices, intelligence summaries, radio traffic analysis, repair crews at Pearl Harbor, logistics decisions made before anyone knew exactly how the battle would unfold, and the staff discipline required to translate fragmentary information into actionable deployment. That combination makes the battle uniquely instructive. It reassures and unsettles at the same time. Individual courage mattered immensely, but courage alone would not have created the ambush. Nor would intelligence alone have won the morning if squadrons had failed to find the enemy or if deck crews had not kept ships functioning under pressure. Japanese memory of Midway was also shaped by the way the empire managed wartime information. The battle was not instantly integrated into public understanding in the same open way that American victory propaganda would later elevate it. Damage was concealed, explained away, or compartmentalized. That secrecy may have preserved morale in the short term, but it also limited the kind of institutional self-criticism that disaster sometimes makes possible. Militaries learn after defeat only if they can admit enough reality to adjust. Japan did learn some lessons, of course, but Midway also became one of those battles where prestige and denial partially protected the old culture from the full force of what had happened. The same empire that had built a deadly and brilliant carrier arm found it much harder to absorb, in institutional terms, what the destruction of that arm actually meant. The battle also tells us something about command personalities. Fletcher and Spruance were different officers, and Midway did not erase those differences. Nimitz' willingness to place Spruance, a man without the flamboyant aura of a carrier legend, in decisive command after Halsey fell ill demonstrated a quality often undervalued in wartime myth-making: institutional flexibility. Great victories are often assigned afterward to charismatic names, but they also depend on organizations capable of elevating competent men quickly when circumstance demands it. Spruance's calm, disciplined command style proved crucial. He was not trying to write legend. He was trying to make the right decisions under conditions where information came late, contact could vanish, and overaggression could expose the few surviving American carriers to ruin. That combination of aggression and restraint is one reason Midway does not reduce to lucky timing. It required command judgment good enough not to waste the opportunity once chance revealed it. In the wider Pacific imagination, Midway endures because it is one of those battles where scale and intimacy coexist without cancelling each other. The strategic consequences were global. The battlefield itself was mostly open water. Yet what people remember are still the intensely human details: torpedo planes flying low into impossible fire, dive bombers dropping out of the sun, sailors abandoning Yorktown, smoke pouring from flight decks, signal lamps flashing, and damage control teams running into furnace-like compartments because there was still a possibility, however small, that a ship could be saved. Those images remain powerful because they convert abstract turning points into mortal experience. They remind us that history changes direction through bodies before it becomes a sentence in a textbook. If Pearl Harbor was the blow that awakened the United States, then the months before Midway were the months in which that awakening had to survive humiliation. The Pacific War did not move in a straight line from shock to revenge. It moved first through a phase of strategic shortage. There were too few carriers, too few trained air groups, too few opportunities to choose where to fight, and too many fronts on which Japanese momentum appeared to be setting the terms. This matters because Midway was not fought by an America already dominant in production and confidence. It was fought by an America still trying to hold itself together in the Pacific long enough for production and confidence to matter. The early war had imposed a strange dual consciousness on US commanders. On the one hand, they knew industrial superiority would eventually transform the balance if time could be purchased. On the other hand, they also knew that time could not simply be assumed. A second major carrier defeat in 1942 might not have ended the war, but it could have postponed offensive recovery dramatically, exposed Hawaii more acutely, deepened Japanese perimeter control, and forced the United States into a more defensive and politically anxious Pacific strategy. In that sense, Midway was both a tactical battle and a contest over time itself. Whoever came out of it stronger would not merely gain ships or headlines. They would gain months, perhaps a year, of strategic tempo in a war where tempo was often the hidden currency beneath all public language. This is also why the Battle of the Coral Sea belongs inside the Midway story rather than before it as a detached prelude. Coral Sea in May 1942 had already demonstrated that the age of carrier battles fought beyond visual range was fully present. It had also inflicted losses that shaped Midway directly. The Japanese light carrier Shoho was sunk, and the fleet carrier Shokaku was heavily damaged, while Zuikaku's air group was depleted badly enough to keep her from joining the Midway operation. Those absences mattered enormously. Japan went into Midway with 4 first-line carriers instead of 6. The Americans, meanwhile, lost Lexington and saw Yorktown damaged, but they also gained something no less important than experience: a sharper understanding of what carrier battle under stress actually felt like. Coral Sea was not a clear strategic triumph in the same way Midway would later appear, but it altered the next battle's geometry. It denied Yamamoto part of his strength and taught American commanders that the war's decisive encounters were likely to be fought not by battle lines seeing one another across open sea, but by scouting, launch cycles, flight deck management, and the terrifying invisibility of aviation strike warfare. The American command structure at Midway also deserves patient attention because it reveals how institutions absorb shock. Chester Nimitz is often remembered as calm, intelligent, and quietly formidable, all of which he was. But calm is not a strategy by itself. What made his role so important was his ability to translate incomplete intelligence into a coherent operational wager. He did not need perfect certainty to decide that the American carriers should be in position northeast of Midway. He needed enough confidence to bet the Pacific Fleet's surviving carrier strength on the analysts being right. That is a different kind of courage from the one associated with cockpit heroics, but it is courage nonetheless. The willingness to act on probability rather than wait for certainty is one of the hardest disciplines in war, especially after a recent catastrophe like Pearl Harbor. Institutions bruised by surprise often become risk-averse in the name of prudence. Nimitz chose a form of risk that looked, from another angle, like the only real prudence available. Raymond Spruant's place in the battle is equally revealing. He was not the glamorous choice in popular imagination. He was there because William Halsey, whose aggressive reputation loomed large, was ill. A less flexible institution might have treated that substitution as a crippling misfortune. Instead, the US Navy placed immense weight on a man who, though experienced and intelligent, did not embody the flamboyant legend later generations often seek in war stories. Spruant's style mattered because Midway rewarded disciplined aggressiveness rather than theatrical boldness. He had to press when the opening appeared and restrain when uncertainty made overextension dangerous. Carrier battle makes vanity costly. A commander who chases too hard with too little information can turn victory back into vulnerability with astonishing speed. Spruant understood that success at Midway lay not merely in striking first but in preserving enough force after striking to survive what the enemy might still be able to do. That mixture of caution and violence is part of what made the American performance more mature than the opening months of the Pacific War might have suggested. Frank Jack Fletcher, too, deserves more respect than he sometimes receives in streamlined narratives. Because he was senior and because Yorktown's air group played such a critical role, Fletcher's decisions mattered deeply, even though later memory often casts Spruant as the clearer hero. Fletcher had already been blooded at Coral Sea. He understood carrier vulnerability in immediate, practical terms. His management of Yorktown, and his decision to delegate tactical command in ways that matched circumstances, were part of the institutional competence that allowed the Americans to fight as effectively as they did. Midway was not won by one commanding personality standing alone over the map. It was won by a command team making enough correct judgments under awful uncertainty to let opportunity become real before it vanished. The Japanese side presents a different but equally fascinating command picture. Nagumo Chuichi has often borne the burden of historical blame because his decks were found in transition and because his scouting and rearming decisions became so central to the battle's mythology. Yet Nagumo was also a commander placed inside a doctrinal and operational framework whose contradictions had been inherited, not invented by him. Carrier commanders in 1942 lived inside systems that were still learning how to reconcile the demands of search, strike, reserve management, combat air patrol, anti-submarine caution, and the plain terror of not knowing where the enemy's decks were. Nagumo's morning was not a leisurely sequence of bad choices but a compression chamber. Midway had not been fully neutralized. Enemy surface contacts were reported but not immediately clarified as carrier contacts. Midway-based aircraft kept attacking. The reserve had to be configured for some target, and each configuration consumed time. To say he made mistakes is true. To say those mistakes were easy to avoid is another matter. The larger tragedy is that Japanese doctrine had built an operational style so dependent on sharp timing and information control that once timing and information both deteriorated, the margin for correction became terrifyingly thin. Yamamoto's own command design compounded the problem. He was the architect of a giant operation and the mind most conscious of its strategic necessity, but he was also leading from a distance. His dispersal of forces reflected broader Japanese strategic instincts about deception, coverage, and decisive battle sequencing. Yet carrier war had begun to punish dispersal more ruthlessly than earlier naval paradigms had. The old logic in which fast-striking forces, battleships, and supporting echelons could be arranged in layered depth now risked becoming a source of fatal separation. By the time Nagumo's carriers were in crisis, Yamamoto's heavier units were not in position to rescue the battle center. Midway therefore also stands as a warning about how rapidly operational reality can outgrow inherited command structures. A plan can preserve doctrinal elegance and still fail the battle it is meant to win. Code breaking deserves even deeper treatment because it is one of the few forms of wartime success that can appear bloodless and almost magical from afar while being neither. The Station Hypo team at Pearl Harbor did not sit in serene certainty reading the enemy's soul. They worked through fragments, probabilities, translations, traffic patterns, and endless intellectual stress. Signals intelligence in 1942 was an art of disciplined inference. Errors were possible. Overconfidence was possible. Confirmation bias was possible. That famous water shortage ruse succeeded not because the analysts lived in a spy novel but because they understood how to test a hypothesis using the enemy's own communications habits. That act of testing is what makes the story so powerful. It was not blind faith in code breaking. It was empirical nerve. The result was operational gold, enough confidence to predict the target, enough timing to position the carriers, enough clarity to convert scattered American strength into an ambush. And still, code breaking did not tell the Americans everything. It did not specify every launch, every weather variation, every course correction, every moment of delay, or the exact emotional sequence inside Nagumo's flagship. This matters because people sometimes imagine intelligence as replacing friction when in fact it only reorganizes friction. Midway remained a battle of missed rendezvous, imperfect radio communication, uncertain scouting reports, and aircraft searching for targets over vast water with fuel diminishing minute by minute. Intelligence gave the Americans the right battlefield. It did not give them a frictionless battle once they arrived there. That is why Midway remained such a rich case study for military professionals. It shows intelligence at its most strategically transformative while also reminding us that transformation still has to pass through human systems that remain vulnerable to confusion, error, fear, and luck. The technical limitations of early war torpedoes are another layer in the story that deserves more emphasis, because they deepen the tragedy of the torpedo squadrons. American aerial torpedoes in 1942 were notoriously unreliable. They could run too deep, fail to detonate, or behave unpredictably under combat conditions. This meant that the men flying low and straight toward Japanese carriers were often risking death not merely for a difficult shot but for a weapon system that could betray them even if they delivered that shot under impossible pressure. This fact enlarges rather than diminishes their sacrifice. They were not only brave. They were brave inside a system that had not yet solved one of the most basic problems of the weapon they had been trained to employ. Midway's emotional power is partly born from this kind of layered injustice. Some of the men whose destruction made victory possible were sent forward with tools not fully worthy of the risks imposed upon them. The Japanese Zero fighter has also become a kind of mythic presence in Pacific War memory, and Midway reinforced that aura even as it revealed its limitations. In June 1942, the Zero remained one of the finest carrier fighters in the world in terms of maneuverability and combat experience. In low-altitude combat against slow, exposed American torpedo planes, it was devastating. But Midway also showed that fighter superiority cannot solve every problem once command attention is saturated and attack geometries multiply. The Japanese combat air patrol was tactically lethal, yet it could still be pulled down, fragmented, and mispositioned by the sequence of attacks unfolding that morning. This is another reason the battle resists simple narratives of technology. Superb machines still live inside tactical and operational systems. If those systems are stressed correctly, even excellent machines can be in the wrong place at the wrong moment. The flight deck itself was one of Midway's most dangerous and revealing spaces. Carrier war is often imagined through pilots and admirals, but deck crews lived inside a kind of industrial theater of risk that became catastrophic when timing failed. Aircraft had to be fueled, armed, spotted, moved, launched, recovered, and protected in choreography that tolerated little confusion and almost no major interruption. On Japanese carriers at the decisive moment, this choreography became vulnerability. Aviation fuel, bombs, torpedoes, and aircraft were all part of a tightly packed operating organism. When American bombs arrived, they did not merely damage structures. They pierced an ecosystem of war at exactly the point where its density gave it speed but also made it combustible beyond easy control. The ensuing fires were not just accidents of impact. They were the violent revelation of how carrier power stores destruction within itself even when it is not yet attacking. American damage control, by contrast, offered one of the battle's quiet strategic contrasts. Yorktown's temporary recovery after taking bomb hits was not merely an inspiring anecdote. It reflected institutional habits, training, design, and command confidence under stress. Damage control is culture made visible under fire. A navy that trains men to fight their ships after the first wound gives itself a margin that can be the difference between losing a unit quickly and keeping it operational, even if only for another critical hour. Yorktown's crew demonstrated that margin. Later, submarine attack would doom the ship. But the earlier recovery mattered because it showed how navies survive not just by striking well but by refusing to die on the enemy's preferred timetable. The submarine component of Midway often feels peripheral in public memory because the carrier air battle dominates the narrative, yet submarine presence remained part of the larger danger field. The eventual torpedoing of Yorktown and Hammond by IA-168 reminds us that the oceanic battlefield did not stop being lethal once the famous dive bombing sequence ended. Rescue, salvage, and consolidation all took place under ongoing threat. This is one reason battle narratives built around a single decisive moment can mislead. Midway did have such a moment, but the battle's human and strategic reality extended beyond it. Men still died after the turning point had already entered history. Ships still sank after victory had become intelligible. The sea does not stop killing because the narrative has already decided what mattered most. There is also a logistic story beneath Midway that deserves more credit. The United States in 1942 was not yet the fully mobilized colossus of later war memory. Everything was still in transition. Repair infrastructure, training throughput, aircraft production, carrier deployment, and global allocation all required choices under scarcity. That Yorktown returned in time for Midway was partly a feat of shipyard labor and partly a strategic decision about acceptable risk. Repair crews worked with intensity not because anyone thought the ship was fully restored but because good enough for the next battle was the real standard the moment required. This reveals something profound about wartime institutions at their best. They do not wait for ideal conditions. They decide what must be made adequate in time. Japanese logistics tell a harsher story of momentum stretching itself thinner. The carrier force at Midway was formidable, but the wider strategic map was already asking too much of Japanese naval and industrial systems. Expansion across the Pacific and Southeast Asia created immense frontiers to garrison, supply, and defend. Training pipelines could not expand veteran aviators quickly. Replacement rhythms for losses in men and planes were weaker than early victories encouraged many to notice. This does not mean Midway was really decided by industry already. Battles are not so simple. But it does mean that the losses at Midway landed on a state whose margin for replacing elite naval aviation was far smaller than the brilliance of its first 6 months of war had suggested. The battle's outcome therefore became larger than the ships alone because it exposed the difference between immediate operational excellence and long-term regenerative capacity. The Aleutian diversion is another part of the Midway story that often gets reduced to a footnote, yet it reveals much about Japanese strategic thinking. The northern operation was intended to distract and complicate American response, and in a broad sense it fit the desire to multiply uncertainty. But Midway shows how diversions can become signs of overdesign when the central battle ends up hinging on concentration. The resources sent north were not enough by themselves to decide the main action, but their existence reflects a strategic culture still trying to enlarge operational elegance rather than simplify it. One of the most ruthless lessons of modern war is that once decisive battle arrives, elegance can be the enemy of concentration. Midway punished the Japanese not because they were incapable of deception, but because the most important fight still came down to the vulnerable center they had not protected enough with simplicity. The battle also illuminates the role of weather and visibility, not as romantic scenery but as operational facts. Clouds, sun angle, horizon haze, and oceanic emptiness all shaped how aircraft searched, how targets were found, and how attacks were delivered. Dive bombers arriving out of the sun are not just a cinematic phrase. The visual environment can determine how much reaction time defenders possess and how quickly attack geometry becomes lethal. Carrier war at this stage remained deeply dependent on visual acquisition. Radar existed, but not yet in the integrated, dominant form it would later assume. Midway therefore belonged partly to the age of the eye, our scout spotting wakes, pilots scanning the horizon, commanders waiting on visual confirmation that could arrive too late to matter or just in time to change the world. Another aspect of Midway that deserves more emphasis is the emotional life aboard the Japanese carriers during the fatal minutes. Historical writing often follows the American perspective because the victory narrative gives it natural centrality. But to understand the full human truth of the battle, one must also imagine what it was like when a force that had spent half a year operating with terrifying confidence suddenly found itself broken before noon. Veteran crews who had struck Pearl Harbor and ranged across the Indian Ocean now faced uncontrolled fires, exploding ordnance, failing communications, and the rapid realization that what was happening was not damage in the ordinary sense but institutional death. These men were not abstractions of imperial aggression. They were sailors and aviators trapped inside a machine of war that had worked brilliantly until it did not. Midway's moral and human seriousness lies partly in refusing to flatten the enemy into symbolic targets once the bombs fall. The battle's aftermath in the United States was also more complicated than straightforward celebration. Midway was a desperately needed victory, and it was presented as such. Yet naval professionals understood that the war was far from won. Carrier strength remained precious. Pilot training still needed vast expansion. The Japanese fleet remained dangerous. American victory culture would later create an impression of an unstoppable industrial steamroller, but in mid-1942 the future still looked demanding and uncertain. Midway changed the direction of possibility. It did not remove risk. In some ways it made the next phase harder, because winning a turning point creates the obligation to exploit it, and exploitation in the South Pacific would require another series of exhausting, attritional contests that no one could yet script cleanly. The Japanese aftermath was different in tone but equally consequential. Defeat had to be explained inside a command culture and political order poorly suited to open strategic confession. The empire had sold victory to itself through momentum, discipline, and prestige. Midway shattered the material basis of that image in the carrier sphere, but not the public habits that had grown around it. This gap between reality and explanation is strategically dangerous. States that cannot tell themselves the truth about defeat lose some of their ability to adapt before the next defeat arrives. Japan did continue fighting effectively after Midway, and its forces would prove deadly again and again. But the battle marked the beginning of an erosion that no subsequent brilliance could fully reverse. Midway is also one of the clearest examples of why the phrase turning point must be handled carefully. Turning points are often misunderstood as moments after which victory becomes automatic. That is almost never true. Midway did not guarantee American triumph. It did not cancel Japanese strength in the Solomons, New Guinea, or the wider Pacific. What it did was alter the strategic slope. Before Midway, Japan could still plausibly imagine setting the pace of the war from a position of carrier superiority. After Midway, every major offensive calculation had to account for a reality in which that superiority had been broken and the United States retained enough core strength to begin taking the initiative. Turning points matter not because they finish wars, but because they change what future decisions can realistically mean. The educational value of Midway for later generations of naval officers has been immense for precisely this reason. It teaches not one lesson but many, and some of them cut against each other. It teaches the value of intelligence and the danger of over-reliance on incomplete scouting. It teaches aggressive search and the risks of chasing certainty too far with fuel running low. It teaches deck discipline and the catastrophic vulnerability of carriers caught in transition. It teaches the cost of sacrifice that does not look useful in the moment. It teaches command flexibility and the danger of excessive operational complexity. It teaches that chance matters, but that chance matters most inside structures already prepared to exploit or suffer it. Few battles offer so many interlocking lessons without dissolving into pure chaos. Midway remains legible enough to teach and complex enough to resist reduction. Perhaps that is why it still feels so modern. In an age obsessed with information, sensors, and command networks, Midway reminds us that superior information does not abolish fear, confusion, or timing. In an age that often celebrates precision, it reminds us that precision operates inside systems vulnerable to overload. In an age that likes clean success stories, it reminds us that decisive victory can be built out of miscoordination, loss, and sacrifice that only later becomes meaningful. Above all, it reminds us that power at its height is often most vulnerable at the moment it still believes its own momentum is enough. By the time the battle was over, the Pacific had not become simpler. It had become more possible for the United States and more finite for Japan. The carriers burned, but so too did an assumption that Japanese offensive superiority would define the war's next phase. The ocean remained vast. The fighting ahead remained terrible. Yet after Midway the future no longer leaned in the same direction. That is why a few hours on the 4th of June, 1942 still cast such a long shadow over naval history. They did not decide everything. They decided enough. If Midway is one of the Pacific War's decisive battles, then Pearl Harbor remains the ghost hovering over it. The Japanese attack in December 1941 had been conceived not simply as revenge or demonstration, but as preemptive operational surgery. Japan needed time to secure a defensive empire and hoped to inflict such an opening wound on the US Pacific Fleet that Washington would either negotiate or arrive too slowly to reverse the new order. Yet Pearl Harbor had contained within it the contradiction that made Midway possible. Battleships were wrecked, yes. Prestige was shattered. The psychological effect was enormous. But the American carriers were absent, and in the age of carrier warfare absence could matter more than the spectacle of destruction. That omission haunted Japanese strategic thought afterward. It is one reason Yamamoto kept reaching for another major carrier engagement. Pearl Harbor had been brilliant. It had also been incomplete. Midway was the attempt to complete it. This is one of the ironies that gives Midway its particular dramatic shape. A victory that looked overwhelming in December made a second victory necessary by June. Strategic success can create dependency on repetition. Once Japan had demonstrated the power of naval aviation at Pearl Harbor, it could not afford to let the surviving American carriers continue existing as free variables in the Pacific. The war's logic pushed toward another encounter. Yet every attempt to force a decisive battle exposes the forcing power itself to risk. Midway therefore grew directly out of Japan's earlier triumph. Pearl Harbor made Midway strategically desirable. The very need to seek Midway opened the path to disaster. The Japanese naval air arm that entered the battle had been built through years of extraordinarily demanding training. This is important because it explains both its brilliance and its vulnerability. Japan's pre-war pilot training system was selective, rigorous, and geared toward quality rather than mass throughput. The result was a cadre of highly skilled aviators capable of extraordinary performance in range, navigation, deck operation, and combat. In the opening phase of the Pacific War, that edge was real. But quality built through narrow throughput has a strategic weakness. It is difficult to replace quickly once battle starts consuming experience. Midway was catastrophic not only because carriers were lost, but because men whose training represented years of institutional investment were killed, trapped, burned, or forced down into the sea. Their loss accelerated a shift that no Japanese victory dispatch could conceal forever. The Empire's early war edge in carrier aviation was finite. American training in 1942 was different in style and still in transition. In some respects it was rougher, less polished, and less mature than the Japanese system it faced. Yet it existed inside a state whose industrial and educational capacity could scale. Midway therefore sits at a point where immediate Japanese excellence and long-term American regenerative power intersected. The battle's outcome did not create that structural contrast, but it exposed it. A navy can absorb ship loss if it can rebuild ships. It can recover from pilot loss only if its training system, fuel supply, aircraft production, and institutional learning can expand with wartime demand. By 1942 the United States was moving into that expansion. Japan was already approaching the limits of a more elite but less replaceable model. Midway made the cost of that difference visible in one violent burst. The doctrine of attack coordination deserves a deeper look because Midway is often remembered for the successful dive bomber strikes without enough attention to how difficult carrier strike coordination still was in 1942. Aircraft launched from different carriers under varying time pressures, with different navigational assumptions, weather conditions, and fuel margins. Fighters, torpedo squadrons, and dive bombers did not always arrive in the intended sequence. Radio discipline, command habits, and the sheer distance of the search area all complicated timing. Midway therefore was not a battle in which the Americans executed a perfectly synchronized combined strike. It was a battle in which imperfectly coordinated attacks still produced strategic brilliance because their very misalignment destabilized Japanese defenses long enough for the final blow to land. This is an uncomfortable but important point. Military effectiveness does not always look clean in the moment. Sometimes it emerges from the enemy's inability to cope with a messy but relentless sequence of pressures. The Japanese strike system was in some respects more polished, but polish can conceal its own rigidity. When operations unfold according to plan, a highly trained carrier force can look almost mechanical in its precision. When the information picture fragments and target priorities change mid-cycle, that same force can become trapped by the complexity of its own procedures. Midway's rearming dilemma was not simply a matter of bad timing. It was also a matter of a powerful operational organism being asked to reverse itself under combat stress while the clock was running. The more intensely a force is optimized for efficient striking, the more vulnerable it may become when efficiency is broken at the wrong moment. Midway revealed that contradiction in the sharpest possible way. No discussion of Midway is complete without a deeper look at the human catastrophe of the torpedo squadrons. Their losses have become iconic, but icons can smooth away pain. These were not abstract sacrificial figures stepping onto a stage already marked for immortality. They were young aviators flying obsolete or vulnerable aircraft into defenses they could see clearly enough to understand what awaited them. Many of them knew they were entering an almost impossible attack geometry. They still went. Ensign George Gay of Torpedo Squadron 8 became famous partly because he survived when almost no one else did, floating in the water and watching the battle unfold around him. But his survival also highlights the scale of loss that made the squadron story so haunting. These men did not achieve the kind of success militaries prefer to celebrate. They did something more disturbing. They failed in the immediate, tactical sense and became indispensable in the larger one. History often honors victory. Midway forces us to honor the dead whose visible failure created victory for others. Dive bombing, too, deserves to be imagined not as cinematic abstraction but as a physically and mentally punishing act. Pilots had to locate targets over immense ocean, commit to steep attack angles, hold nerve under anti-aircraft fire, release with precision, and then recover without blacking out or flying into debris, smoke, or the sea. When the famous American dive bombers rolled over onto the Japanese carriers, they were not descending in heroic calm. They were entering seconds of extreme cognitive compression in which training, instinct, fear, geometry, and luck all met at once. The phrase "arrived at exactly the right time" is true enough, but it can make the event sound passive, as though timing itself won the battle. Timing had to be inhabited by men capable of converting it into bombs on target. The Japanese deck crews and damage control parties lived the inverse of this terror. Carrier crews are always close to violence because the machinery of aviation is itself dangerous even before enemy attack begins. Fuel, bombs, aircraft, wiring, hoses, lifts, and hangar operations create a workplace where routine safety is always provisional. Under bomb impact, that workplace becomes a labyrinth of explosions, flame, smoke, and broken command channels. On Akagi, Kaga, and Sarayu, the battle ceased to be a matter of naval maneuver and became a fight inside burning steel. Men trying to contain damage in these conditions were not only struggling against heat and fire. They were struggling against the fact that the ship's very design as an offensive carrier now magnified the consequences of every successful enemy hit. Midway's decisive minutes therefore also belong to the brutally intimate war of shipboard survival. Another crucial layer is the role of maintenance and ordnance personnel before the bombs fell. War stories naturally privilege the moments of action, but action is made possible by labor. Carrier strike groups only function because aircraft are serviced, armed, inspected, fueled, and moved with discipline that can endure fatigue. The Japanese carrier arm excelled in these routines, and the Americans were improving at them rapidly. Midway was therefore a battle between two labor systems as much as between two sets of pilots. When American bombs hit Japanese carriers in their transitional state, they did not merely destroy machines. They annihilated a labor environment at the peak of its operational intensity. To understand why the fires became uncontrollable, one must understand how much of carrier power resides not in the glamorous moment of launch but in the dense backstage world that makes launch possible. The psychological burden of command at sea is another of Midway's deepest themes. Battles on land often allow commanders to imagine some relation to terrain, reserves, and lines of retreat that carrier battle radically alters. At Midway, the most powerful ships in the world could be alive, operational, and apparently secure 1 minute and effectively dead the next, all without ever sighting the enemy directly. This produces a command environment in which uncertainty is not occasional friction but the permanent climate of decision. Nagumo's Morning captures the terror of this climate from one side. Nimitz, Fletcher, and Spruance capture it from the other. No one at Midway possessed a stable picture for long. Every major decision was therefore a wager on a moving reality. That is one reason the battle remains so compelling to modern strategists. It dramatizes what it means to command under conditions where the decisive fact may arrive late, ambiguously, or not at all. There is a temptation to describe Midway as the battle where intelligence triumphed over operational brilliance. That phrase is too neat. Japan's operational brilliance remained formidable. The American victory did not erase it. Nor did intelligence act independently of combat performance. Midway is better understood as the battle where foreknowledge allowed a weaker force to choose the right place to take a deadly risk, and where that risk was redeemed by enough tactical and operational execution to convert information into destruction. Intelligence without aggressive follow-through would have produced only a better organized defeat. Tactical courage without intelligence might have produced another futile search across the wrong ocean. Midway mattered because those elements converged just enough, and just in time. The battle also had a profound effect on the relationship between the US Navy and the American public. After Pearl Harbor and the opening defeats, the public needed proof not only that Japan could be fought, but that the Navy in particular remained capable of meeting and defeating the enemy's finest forces. Midway provided that proof in a way that no bureaucratic promise ever could. Naval war is difficult to make emotionally legible to civilians because so much happens far from sight. Midway solved that problem by offering a result stark enough to narrate clearly: for Japanese carriers lost, one American carrier lost, the enemy checked at the very moment he still seemed most dangerous. It became a story the public could understand without mastering carrier doctrine. That alone gave it enormous power. Yet it is also worth noting how later American memory polished Midway into a cleaner national myth than the battle itself was. Victory narratives tend to compress uncertainty, disagreement, and luck. They tend to turn complicated command relationships into a sequence of decisive personalities and to flatten sacrifice into noble inevitability. Midway resists that polishing when read carefully. It contains too many missed connections, too many tactical failures, too much dependence on timing that no participant fully controlled. That resistance is not a weakness in the story. It is the reason the story stays alive. Battles that become too neat become less human. Midway remains profoundly human because it preserves the marks of chaos inside triumph. The Japanese side of memory has its own distortions. Because public acknowledgement of the defeat was constrained, because prestige still mattered, and because the Empire continued fighting, Midway did not instantly become the national wound it appears in hindsight. But within naval understanding it was impossible to ignore. For carriers represented far more than tonnage. They represented the destruction of the spearhead around which Japanese maritime offense had been organized. It is one thing to recognize in theory that a force is finite. It is another to watch that finitude become fire and ruin on a single day. Midway therefore belongs to the internal story of Japanese overreach just as much as it belongs to the American story of recovery. The relationship between Midway and Guadalcanal reveals how turning points actually operate. Had the Japanese won at Midway or even fought the Americans to a rough strategic draw, the timetable and confidence behind the Guadalcanal offensive would have looked very different. Conversely, if the United States had won at Midway but then failed to exploit the opening, the battle's meaning would have shrunk. This is why historians are right to call Midway decisive, but only if decisive is understood dynamically. A decisive battle does not have to end the war to deserve the term. It must alter what futures are feasible. Midway did that. It widened American feasible futures and narrowed Japanese ones. There is a further institutional lesson in the contrast between Japanese and American adaptability. The Americans entered 1942 wounded but open to rapid adjustment. Code breaking was integrated into operations. Yorktown was repaired at astonishing speed. Command substitutions were absorbed. Tactical failures were survived. The Japanese entered 1942 with greater immediate battlefield excellence but less room for regenerative improvisation once core assets were lost. Midway revealed that war rewards not only the side that fights best in the present, but the side that can transform information, labor, and organizational resilience into renewed fighting power after shock. In this sense, Midway belongs to the history of adaptation as much as to the history of battle. The battle's geography also deserves a final word. Midway was fought over an ocean that dwarfed human scale. This mattered because vastness was not just backdrop. It was part of the battle's logic. Search patterns, delays, fuel loads, weather, and navigation all acquired greater significance precisely because the Pacific was so large. A wrong heading, a delayed report, a missed contact, or a wasted launch did not carry local consequences only. Over those distances, small errors could become strategic. The Pacific turned every act of reconnaissance and timing into something closer to fate. Midway is therefore inseparable from the sea itself, not merely as a stage, but as the element that amplified uncertainty until command became an argument with distance. And finally, there is the emotional shape of the victory. Some victories release joy immediately. Midway released something harder and more sober. Relief, yes. Confidence, yes. But also the knowledge that even the most necessary victory in the Pacific would be purchased at a cost measured in burning ships, drowned airmen, shattered squadrons, and years more of war still ahead. This is one reason Midway continues to feel adult in a way some battlefield myths do not. It contains no easy innocence. The Americans who won it did so after months of defeat and at the cost of men whose role in the victory only became clear after they were already gone. The Japanese who lost it did so as veterans of earlier triumphs, not as caricatures of incompetence. The battle remains morally and strategically serious because it grants humanity to all that it destroys without blurring what it changed. By the end of Midway, the Pacific was still full of danger, but it was no longer arranged in quite the same way. Japan could still wound, still seize, still fight magnificently in many engagements to come. Yet the confidence that had driven the empire outward from Pearl Harbor through the spring of 1942 now had to coexist with a new reality. The United States had shown that it could anticipate, ambush, and break the core of Japanese carrier power. The war's future would be fought under that shadow. That is enough to explain why Midway endures. Not because it solved everything in June 1942, but because it made a different future possible and made the old future far less likely. The American industrial story after Midway is often invoked too lazily, as if production statistics themselves won the battle retroactively. But numbers alone do not explain why Midway mattered when it did. What they do explain is why the battle's asymmetry was so historically powerful. Once the United States had survived long enough to begin converting industrial depth into sustained naval strength, every Japanese loss in elite carrier assets became harder to reverse relative to the enemy's future growth. Midway did not suddenly summon Essex-class carriers into existence. It did something subtler and more consequential. It protected the time in which those future carriers, aircraft, pilots, and logistical systems would come to matter. That is the strategic meaning of survival in industrial war. One does not need to be strong enough today to dominate. One must be strong enough today to ensure that tomorrow still belongs to one side. Midway gave the United States more of that tomorrow. For Japan, by contrast, Midway revealed the cruel arithmetic of a shorter war strategy beginning to fail. The empire had hoped that rapid conquest, defensive perimeter expansion, and a succession of sharp blows might produce either negotiated settlement or a war fought on terms favorable enough to compensate for long-term material inferiority. This was not wholly irrational. Japan could not outbuild the United States in a prolonged contest. It had to win position, prestige, and psychological advantage quickly enough to reshape the political environment before industrial comparison became dominant. Midway did not make that strategy irrational after the fact. It showed how much depended on never suffering the kind of concentrated carrier defeat the strategy could least endure. Once that defeat came, the larger concept remained intact only on paper. In practice, the Empire would spend the rest of the war fighting increasingly from a deficit it could not permanently hide. The battle also deserves comparison with Tsushima in 1905, even if the comparison can mislead as much as it illuminates. Japanese naval prestige in the first half of the 20th century had been shaped profoundly by Tsushima, the great decisive battle against Russia that seemed to validate the idea that a concentrated fleet action could settle imperial destiny. Midway, in a strange way, was both the successor to that tradition and the event that transformed it. It remained a battle in which decisive concentration mattered. But the medium of decision had changed. There were no opposing battle lines seeing one another and destroying one another with heavy guns in direct exchange. Instead, the essence of fleet action had migrated into scouting, launch timing, deck management, and aircraft striking at horizons no admiral could physically see. Midway therefore stands at the hinge between Japanese naval mythologies. It still belongs to the older dream of decisive battle. It also proves that the old form of decisive battle was gone. Another way to grasp Midway's importance is through the problem of replacement not only in pilots, but in experience-rich command teams. Naval aviation in 1942 was not an interchangeable machine in which any hull could host any air group with immediate effect. Commanders, deck officers, squadron leaders, maintenance personnel, and fighter direction practices all formed linked ecosystems. The Japanese carriers destroyed at Midway were embedded in just such ecosystems. Their loss therefore had an institutional afterlife beyond the casualty lists. New air groups could be formed. New ships could enter service. But one does not rapidly reproduce the dense, informal professional memory created by months and years of real operations at the center of a victorious striking force. Midway wounded that memory. In some ways, the most decisive fires of the 4th of June burned not only aircraft and steel, but habits of excellence Japan had assumed it would carry forward more easily than it in fact could. The surviving Japanese carriers and aviation units would continue to fight hard, of course, and later battles would reveal that Midway had not solved every American weakness or erased every Japanese strength. Santa Cruz, for example, would show how dangerous Japanese carrier aviation could still be. That matters because it prevents the triumphalist mistake of imagining Midway as the point after which Japan ceased to be formidable. It remained formidable enough to inflict acute pain. But Midway altered the quality of that danger. Japan could still win sharp local encounters. What it became less able to do was sustain carrier superiority as the structuring fact of the ocean. That distinction matters immensely in strategic history. States do not need to lose every battle to lose the logic under which their earlier victories made sense. The American side also learned hard lessons from what went wrong even inside success. Air group coordination remained a problem. Torpedo squadrons had been sent into slaughter under conditions that should trouble any serious reader of the battle. Communications were imperfect. Navigation difficulties were severe. Midway therefore entered American professional memory not only as proof of courage and intelligence triumph, but as a warning about tactical and doctrinal deficiencies that still needed repair. Victorious institutions that cannot study the uglier parts of their victories become vulnerable in ways less visible than defeat but still dangerous. The US Navy did study them. The later war would show an increasingly sophisticated integration of radar, fighter direction, anti-aircraft concentration, pilot training, and strike coordination. Midway did not create those improvements by itself, but it provided a battlefield argument for why they mattered. There is also a wider political point. The Pacific War after Midway remained a coalition war in an uneven sense, involving Australia, New Zealand, Britain, China, and many colonial and occupied societies whose lives were caught inside the conflict. Yet Midway strengthened the American center of gravity within that coalition framework. It suggested more convincingly than before that the United States would be able not just to endure but to dominate the Pacific contest over time. For allies and enemies alike, that altered perception mattered. Perception can shift diplomatic behavior, strategic confidence, and the willingness of states to place longer bets. Midway was therefore not only read in naval war colleges. It was read in chancelleries, cabinets, and occupation zones across the wider war. The Japanese home front would never experience Midway in the same cleanly public way the American home front did, but even controlled information environments cannot fully suppress strategic reality forever. Families of lost sailors and airmen, shifts in operational tone, the disappearance of known ships, and the changing rhythm of official claims all eventually create their own knowledge. Wartime states are often most vulnerable not when everyone knows the truth instantly, but when truth diffuses unevenly and begins to corrode confidence from the edges inward. Midway contributed to that longer corrosion. It was not the only cause, and in June 1942 it did not yet produce national crisis on the Japanese home front. But it became one of the battlefields where the Empire's ability to convert tactical brilliance into durable confidence began to weaken. The U.S. Marine and Army aviators on Midway itself occupy an especially interesting place in memory because they embody the battle's relationship between local failure and larger usefulness. Many of their attacks did not achieve the sort of result history textbooks celebrate. And yet these men were part of the mechanism through which the Japanese carrier force was drawn, delayed, distracted, and pressured. There is a broader military lesson here. Not every contribution to victory looks victorious at the point of contact. Some actions matter because they force the enemy to spend attention, fuel, combat air patrol altitude, or precious minutes. Midway's morning was full of such expenditures. A battle can be won by cumulative pressure even when many of the pressures look tactically unsuccessful in isolation. This is why serious military history resists judging every attack only by whether it scored the decisive hit. The emotional shock on the American carriers after the victory strikes must also be imagined carefully. Celebration in the immediate sense would have been too simple a response. Flight decks were recovering aircraft. Men were missing. Reports were partial. Yorktown was still under threat. The enemy was wounded, but not yet entirely silent. This is another reminder that battles as remembered and battles as lived are not the same thing. Historical consciousness likes climactic minutes. Participants live through uncertainty that extends beyond the climactic minute. Even after Akagi, Kaga, and Sarai were burning, the Americans still had to fear the part of the enemy they had not yet seen or finished. The battle's iconic turning point existed inside an atmosphere where no one responsible could yet safely behave as though the day had been won. Midway also altered the moral imagination of the Pacific War because it showed the United States that Japanese offensive power, however formidable, was not mystically beyond interruption. This mattered in a conflict where racialized propaganda, fear after Pearl Harbor, and the speed of Japanese conquest had all fed a sense that the enemy's military machine might be invulnerable unless fought with total desperation. Midway did not humanize the war in any Pacific sense. If anything, later Pacific fighting would become more brutal. But it did puncture the aura of unstoppable expansion that had magnified the enemy in American imagination during the opening months. An enemy stripped of inevitability remains dangerous, but he becomes strategically readable in a different way. The battle's place in Japanese imperial overreach is also illuminating because it reveals how difficult it is for a state at the height of momentum to simplify its own plans. Success encourages breadth. Breadth encourages optimism. Optimism encourages the belief that one more layer of operation, one more diversion, one more sequencing element, one more supporting force can be integrated without loss of control. Midway was a masterpiece of strategic desire and an indictment of strategic overdesign at the same time. It represented what Japan wanted the Pacific to become under its command. It also demonstrated that the larger and more theatrical the design became, the more violently reality might punish its assumptions once uncertainty entered at the center. There is, too, the matter of the Pacific itself as an intellectual battlefield. European military history had long supplied many of the world's most famous strategic templates, but the Pacific forced a confrontation with distance, island logistics, maritime air power, and inter-service coordination at scales that no continental framework could simply absorb. Midway was one of the first great battles in which this new Pacific logic became impossible to misread. The decisive point was not a city, a river line, or a railway junction. It was a mobile and invisible geometry of ships and aircraft over open water. To fight well there required a strategic imagination equal to distance. The Americans were not yet fully masters of that imagination in 1942, but at Midway they possessed enough of it. The Japanese, for all their earlier excellence, found that excellence stretched to the point where too many assumptions had to hold simultaneously. The battle's legacy in naval history also includes a warning about retrospective certainty. Because Midway ended as such a dramatic American victory, later retellings often pull every thread toward that ending as if it had always been latent in each decision. Real contingency disappears in this kind of narrative. Yet contingency is precisely what gives Midway much of its meaning. Had search patterns differed slightly, had torpedo attacks arrived in another sequence, had dive bombers turned back on fuel concerns, had Hiryu's strikes found another American carrier group more cleanly, had Yorktown not been available at all, the battle might still have been fierce and important without becoming the Midway history now remembers. This does not mean the actual result was random. It means historical outcomes are often narrower than national memory later likes to admit. And perhaps that is why Midway still feels almost impossible in the best way. It is a battle where intellectual preparation, operational courage, and brutal luck all remained visible enough that no single explanatory style can swallow the others. Technologists can learn from it. Intelligence professionals can learn from it. Pilots, sailors, command theorists, and historians of institutions can all find their own battle inside it. Some battles become too famous to remain subtle. Midway has escaped that fate. The more one studies it, the less simple it becomes, and the more its turning point status appears earned rather than ornamental. In the end, Midway matters not because it solved the Pacific War in June 1942. It matters because it changed the war's emotional, operational, and strategic climate in a single violent sequence. Before Midway, Japanese initiative still looked like the organizing force of the ocean. After Midway, the future became arguable in a new way. The United States still had to bleed for every gain that followed. Japan still had the strength to kill and resist with terrifying skill. But the great tide of inevitability had been interrupted. That is what turning points really do. They do not end the struggle. They remove one side's ability to treat the struggle as naturally flowing its way. Midway was fought over open sea, yet its consequences reached far beyond it, into Guadalcanal, into industrial planning, into pilot training schools, into the confidence of admirals and politicians, into the home fronts of two empires, and into the whole later history of naval warfare. A few hours of carrier battle in June 1942 were enough to break a vision of Pacific dominance and to give another navy the time it needed to become overwhelming. That is why the battle endures. Not as a neat miracle, but as one of history's clearest examples of how preparation, bravery, and uncertainty can meet in one place and alter the shape of a war. Midway also belongs to the history of fear at the command level. It is easy to discuss decision in war as though deciding were a clean intellectual act. At Midway, decision happened under conditions where wrong decisions could destroy irreplaceable assets in minutes and where even correct decisions might still be punished if they arrived too late. That atmosphere shaped everything. Nagumo's hesitation was not the hesitation of a man relaxing into error. It was the hesitation of a commander trying to reconcile mutually incompatible pressures before time collapsed his options. On the American side, the insistence on continuing searches, launching when the picture was incomplete, and accepting the possibility of severe carrier loss were likewise not pure expressions of confidence. They were expressions of the knowledge that waiting for certainty was itself a choice in favor of losing the initiative. This makes Midway one of the clearest studies in history of what command feels like when action and doubt have to occupy the same mind at once. There is a related lesson in how institutions narrate risk to themselves. Before battle, risk often appears as something to be managed through planning. During battle, risk becomes an environment. Midway's plans mattered. Search arcs, launch windows, reserve configurations, and expected target priorities all mattered. But once the battle was underway, risk stopped looking like a chart and started looking like the sky, the fuel gauge, the radio report, the bomb hit, the unknown contact over the horizon. Institutions that can survive such transition, moving from planned risk to lived risk without freezing, are rare. The US Navy at Midway proved more capable of surviving that transition than many would have guessed in early 1942. The Imperial Japanese Navy, despite all its brilliance, proved more vulnerable to that transition than its earlier victories had suggested. The battle also gives us one of the best windows into how modern war can compress vast structures into tiny moments. Global industrial capacity, code-breaking organizations, pre-war training systems, fuel supply, doctrinal culture, command personalities, weather, and plain courage all existed at immense scale. Yet they met finally in moments measured in seconds: a bomb release, a delayed scout report, a turn back or a turn onward, a deck state at the instant an enemy appeared overhead. That compression is one reason Midway continues to feel almost unreal. The larger the forces behind a battle, the harder it can be to accept that their immediate fate may still depend on the timing of a handful of human acts. And so Midway endures not just as a turning point, but as a revelation. It revealed that the Pacific War would be decided in part by who could best merge information, industry, doctrine, and courage under unbearable uncertainty. It revealed that Japan's opening war brilliance had reached the point where one concentrated defeat could begin undoing it. It revealed that the United States, though still bruised and incomplete, had already learned enough to survive the kind of battle that might have broken it 6 months earlier. Most of all, it revealed that in modern naval war the difference between dominance and disaster may lie not in who possesses the grander dream, but in who can hold together longest when the dream meets friction. That is why Midway still matters. Because once those four carriers burned, the Pacific did not become peaceful. It became different. And that difference was enough. A battle of hours, then, with consequences measured in years.